And our last speaker for this session is Ms. Rory Gordon from Arsenal FX. She is a senior colorist who has worked on over a dozen shows and has been working on cutting edge of technology, including pushing the limits of dynamic range with HDR. She'll be presenting Beyond Better Pixels, how HDR perceptually and emotionally affects storytelling. You'll be hearing a view from the creative perspective, what statistic measurements, and how they relate to creative intent. The study introduces how technical components could contribute to different flavors of immersiveness of image. Please welcome Ms. Gordon.
Thank you, Sally, for that introduction. As Sally said, I'm a colorist at Arsenal FX Color, so in other words, I'm a real-life pixel pusher. So in 2017, we had 3 HDR wide color gamut shows delivering an HDR 10 at Arsenal FX Color. All of them were setting a first season look, all of them were delivering HDR for the first time, and all of them had a distinct visual style. All 3 of these shows seemed to gain something different visually from the HDR transform. So this inspired the question, how does the HDR wide color gamut transform affect these shows qualitatively? Which also inspired the question, oh my gosh, how do you measure that? What I settled on was contrast ratios. For those of you who don't know, a contrast ratio, that would be the ratio of the key side of the face to the fill side of skin tone. This is useful because it's measurable between different style programs. In general, there are humans in all TV shows, and in general, all of them have skin. This describes the relationship of lighting within an image rather than a single mean picture level. So this provides a connection to both how an image was captured and lit, but also skin tone, which, as I said, is arguably the most important storytelling element. Our philosophy as we began HDR. We wanted to allow the transform and color science to carry the bulk of the work. Due to that, we worked collaboratively with a consulting color scientist to create a LUT package for our 100 nit Rec 709 deliverables and our HDR 10 deliverables at 1,000 nits. We wanted there to be, of course, as everyone does, a faithful translation of the original creative intent. And as such, our trims serve to enhance the original visual idea, and then also to, of course, manage edge points and highlights. So this is a diagram of our color pipeline setup. It's probably pretty familiar to a lot of pipelines. We debayer our cameras according to best camera manufacturing practices. We have our preferred log working space, and so we will use an input LUT to manage anything that isn't already in that preferred working space. Your auxiliary cameras, crash cams, drones, all of the annoying buzzy ones that fly overhead. And then our output LUT, we have our output LUT is replaced according to what our deliverable specs are. So if we're targeting our 100 nit pass, we have that output LUT. Nothing is scaled, so to speak. That transform is swapped out for our 1,000 nit and whatever color gamut is necessary, whether it be P3 or Rec 2020, et cetera. And then our HDR trim pass occurs before that output LUT is applied. So similar to an ACE's idea of keeping our color grade information separate from our specific deliverables. So our aesthetic observations. First up, we had The Tick, which is a half-hour superhero satire for Amazon. Is an out-of-this-world, as I said, derived from comic book material. Lots of highly chromatic suits. The Tick is the main character who appears in this bright blue suit. It just stays that bright all the time, and it is also driven from comic book material, so it is required, it is especially desired that it stays the right shade of blue, faithful to that comic book. Also, there's lots of brightly lit evil layers. We suspected that this show would be very well suited to HDR because it is so over the top and it is comic book material. And we were not surprised by the results. It was very compelling to see, especially on the wide color gamut side of the transform, all of these shades given even a little bit more life and over-the-topedness. So next we have The Good Doctor, which is an hour-long medical drama for ABC. This show we suspected would also be an excellent example, an excellent showpiece for the extended dynamic range side of things, especially with all the hot highlights in operating rooms, ambulance lights, all those kind of speculars that are that add to the dramatic tension in these medical shows. We knew that managing those highlights would be a challenge and also just a new bridge that we had to cross. But we were, in general, very happy with the results. And then lastly, we have the show Counterpart, which is an hour-long spy thriller for stars. And this is not necessarily the type of content that one would think of when thinking of HDR for the first time. There's lots of interrogation scenes. It's, like I said, got a light sci-fi element to it as well, lots of characters colliding from different worlds and shadowy environments. So we did find, though, that both the staff at Arsenal and the clients were very moved by the transform, especially in some of this lower light material. So, determining data points to measure. I did not collect 7 million images. That's an extremely impressive data set. My hat's off to you. But instead, I have about 115 data points, so actually 230 if you count the SDR and HDR versions, representative of the show's tone and content to measure the key and fill sides of skin tone. Settled on 3 stills per episode, 1 5 minutes in, 1 at the midpoint, and 1 5 minutes from the end. And this was adjusted to 2.5 minutes for the half-hour comedy. This data point selection was designed to both remove operator bias in representative locations. Like, for example, I might think that a particular OR shows up the most often, but I'm not a robot, sadly, so I'm not sure that I'm right. And it was also designed to sample a variety of setups, and most importantly, eliminate elements like recaps, title sequences, credits, etc., that we don't feel is really representative of the actual story within the show. So obviously, I must acknowledge the statistical uncertainty of this process. So this is a still from the Omnitech Ultra XR scope, which was used. The SDR image of a shot was pulled up. Region of interest was set on the key side of the face in the largest possible square of smooth skin. The mean nit level was recorded for the region of interest. Then the scope was switched into HDR PQ encoding and Rec 2020 color space, and the corresponding HDR still was selected, and that region of interest nit level was recorded as well. And this process was repeated for the fill side of the face as well. In addition to that, I also recorded mean picture level for for the mean picture level of the entire shot in both SDR and HDR. So our results were fairly expected, which was that Counterpart had the greatest contrast ratio in both SDR and HDR. Pretty surprisingly, our mean picture level actually went down for all 3 shows. So here is a representation of all those points. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the key side of the face, and the right side of the screen, you'll see fill levels. It's a little bit out of context when it's just 4 graphs like this, so let me break it down for you a little bit more. Here's an illustration of our SDR contrast ratios. So in general, our contrast ratios went up. You see like I said, on the left side of the screen, the key side of the face, and on the right side, the fill side of the face. And obviously, this is my lovely model, Keisha. Get it? Key, shade? It's a joke. Anyway, thanks for that pity laugh. So in general, the key side of the face went up and the fill side of the face went down. But that is not necessarily the case across the entire board. So what does it mean? It means that transforms have aesthetic consequences. An image's tonality brings out different benefits and consequences of a transform's inherent design. One could see the key side of the face go up and the fill side of the face go up, the key side of the face go up and the fill side of the face go down, the key side of the face go down and the fill side of the face go down on very dark shots. It just depends on where the skin tone falls in the image's tone. So colorists want to trim for these changes according to specific creative intent and program style, not just nit targets. Having this human element allows us to do what LUTs cannot, which is prioritize what about a shot is the most important. So say, for example, we have a silhouette shot. It's very moody, I don't know, maybe on a cliff, and there's lots of pretty sunset going on in the background. In that case, we really do care about the atmosphere and the highlights behind the characters more than the characters themselves. On the flip side, if we have an intimate conversation over a candle at dinner and there's one particularly strong candle in the background, we don't necessarily care about those highlights as much as we care about being able to dive into the faces and the expressions and the emotion of what's going on between those two characters. So we learned that dark matters. As I said, mean picture level went down overall for all these 3 shows, despite the fact that the HDR transform was targeting 1,000 nits in all cases. This shows how much more dark material is in any given show in this study than bright material. It shows that the dark material is numerically influential in mean picture level in addition to being aesthetically consequential. And this shows that consideration of how darker nit levels translate between SDR and HDR is hugely important. And just for informational purposes, in this study, the maximum recorded skin tone was 38 nits in SDR, and it was 109.4 nits in HDR. So lower than one might, when people throw out nit levels for skin tone in HDR, lower than those typical ideas. So this means also that immersive images have different flavors. Immersive is, and not in the VR sense, is frequently thrown around as a buzzword to kind of describe shorthand the aesthetic effect of HDR and wide color gamut. But there's no technical requirement for what makes an image immersive. So in my work on these shows, I began to think of immersion as having 2 axes, one being excitement and one being intimacy. Here's an example of what I would call an exciting immersive image. An exciting immersive image will have a high combination of high luminance and chrominance that evokes a flood of visual information. The pixels in the TV are physically excited, as well as the cones in the eyes of the viewer. On the other hand, an intimate immersive image, which I have an example of here, will have a large portion of the image's exposed value dedicated to a relatively small range of natural stops. So what that means is that you're able to dive deeper into an exposure that you might not necessarily in real life be able to, actually really get a grip on all of that texture and all of that detail. It's sort of like an expanded, heightened sense of real life in a subtle way. So that's intimacy is my shorthand for that. So the benefits of these better pixels. Ansel Adams said, a photograph is usually looked at and seldom looked into. And this is what I really think HDR is the most exciting for, because this allows us to look deeper into these images instead of necessarily throwing something splashy and saying, hey, look, this is something different. We're able to look closer and with more detail into images that surround us all the time. So one of the most important elements, as is shown by this entire study, is skin tone. And greater representation in a diversity of skin tones is going to be a huge advantage in HDR. We think of wide color gamut as giving us all of these, the uniforms on the soccer field, highly chromatic items, but really to me, it's also just as exciting to think about being able to realistically represent different skin tones, and not just dark skin tones and light skin tones, but you have cool undertones and warm undertones and neutral undertones, and being able to have a greater difference between these skin tones that are appearing on screen together, yet have all of them represented flatteringly, is hugely important on a storytelling level, because it allows all of these people that have these different skin tones watching our shows to be able to see themselves represented on screen as normal, as opposed to, old school 50% normal. Nowadays, thanks. Nowadays, we have a lot more normal to think about. So the benefits of these better pixels also serves to enhance psychophysical concepts that we already know and use in SDR. And what I'm talking about is light, dark, and chromatic adaptation. Moving to HDR and wide color gamut magnifies these already understood appearance phenomena. So light adaptation, going from a dark interior to a bright exterior, this dulls our visual sensitivity with the increase in brightness from scene to scene. In HDR, greater difference in dynamic range can create more exciting reveals of characters and plot points. So say you have a character standing over a candle and it's dark and it's moody, and all of a sudden a door opens and there's a flood of light. Oh my gosh, it's just a surprise birthday party, hey. Now in HDR, that reveal can be even more exciting. And as we do our trim passes, of course, we're able to play into these play into these psychophysical phenomena as well. So dark adaptation would be the inverse of the above, occurs as the eye and brain acclimate to dark environments. This results in increased sensitivity when viewing darker material for extended periods of time. That extra sensitivity can also be used as a narrative device when watching longer scenes in a darker view environment. Viewers' increasing sensitivity can allow subtleties to slowly be revealed. So the axe murderer in the corner is slowly revealed as opposed to just showing up and being startling. And then chromatic adaptation, this is my Reader's Digest version of a pretty complicated mechanism. The eye's cones become saturated in the dominant color channel during prolonged exposure, and the brain becomes acclimated to a higher level of saturation. Acclimation creates a new level of normal, and this allows an afterimage to remain. So if we have a scene biased very warm and bright, followed by a cool scene, this shift will feel even more dramatic because our brain has become acclimated to the warmth, and the cool is a big jump. So you can see how in wide color gamut, this is going to happen on a deeper and more intense level. So an example of that here, I have Arthur in The Tick, staring outside of his apartment window, surveying his domain. He is wiped into a map by overkill, and suddenly they're in danger boat, which seems even more dangerous because now it's even more cool in HDR. Allowing SDR and HDR to help each other. So as I said, we're not actually increasing captured data by scaling our scenes to HDR wide color gamut at 1,000 nits and beyond. We are using a better display case for that information which has already been photographed. This reveals impurities in HDR that may simply have been too compressed to read in a smaller color volume. You can think of practical lights, for example, gaseous fall off in fluorescence, or gels around the drums of tungsten lights. Oftentimes we simply can't see them in SDR, albeit that they are there. So as a colorist works more and more with HDR, these impurities can be pre-spotted as a part of the SDR pass, and we know where we can trim, and with experience, we can understand where to trim highlights back without necessarily losing the snap or pop in the SDR image. And then hopefully there's an even more faithful translation between our SDR pass and our HDR pass. And then, of course, ideally, this will ripple to crews on set as HDR on-set monitoring becomes available. DPs and directors can trim for the car that's driving outside the window that they didn't notice, and adjust the lighting on set so it becomes a non-issue. So in conclusion, the most important thing I think I learned from studying this material is that the overall tonality of a show influences what change a standard dynamic range and color mapping transform will aesthetically have. The content itself is actually influencing how the tone mapping what effect it is having on an emotional and storytelling level. There's a great amount of darkness in all style programs, and contrast within those dark values should definitely be further studied. Greater inclusion of diverse skin tones should of course be a part of that. As I mentioned, skin tones recorded in this study are typically lower than what is mentioned as a 50% exposure, and it would certainly be weighty in terms of everyday content that I see every day working on shows. And lastly, this collaborative relationship between color scientist and colorist can help develop multiple options for translating SDR to HDR material, which is not only technically well measured to hit specifications, but is faithful to an aesthetic goal as well. And that's what I have, so do I have time? I think I have time for questions? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.